are
It's
you?
working.
Yeah,
Good.
it's
How are you?
working. I'm good. I'm good. It's good to see you.
Good to see you as well. So everything's working okay?
Yeah, everything's good. Yeah. So, I don't know. Should we just
I'm
like jump
walking
into it
around
or?
looking for the plug to my computer, so
Okay.
please forgive me.
Yeah, no worries. No
I don't know
worries.
what happened to it. It's like a mystery. Anyway, okay, yeah. So you want to start? I'll sit down a second.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, I'm gonna put a phone down. My name is Sarah. Actually went to school at UC Irvine,
Okay.
and I spent time in LA. And I live in Chicago now. I teach art education and sculpture,
Hmm.
and I also organize faculty around the city of Chicago to teach classes at Stateville Prison,
Okay.
which is a maximum security prison down the street from the city,
Wow.
and so that actually makes up a bulk of my work these days. But I think that there's a trajectory for me, at least, between the work that you know about the ARCA suits
Hmm.
to this work today. So
Right.
maybe we could talk about some of that. But well, I think that probably architecture is rarely democratic. I mean, it's set up on the sort of premise of private property,
Hmm.
and so that's kind of a starting point for a lot of architecture. I mean, there's certainly a kind of commons that's built into architecture, or like an idea of common spaces. But yeah, I started doing that work in Los Angeles because, well, I don't know. I mean, frankly, I had been thinking about these kinds of sort of segregated spaces for a long time because I grew up in the South,
Yeah.
in North Carolina, and my parents were not from the South, and so I think that I was always kind of being told a little bit of a counter narrative. I mean, as a white person, I was being told a counter narrative of the space that I was in. Like my parents were not like radical abolitionists or anything like that, but they they didn't grow up in the same way with the same. They just grew up differently than some of our neighbors, and so like our town was really segregated, and it just was like in the sort of like nice Southern way that people enforce that segregation.
Yeah.
And um, so it was always sort of small acts that were things that were said, or small aesthetic things that marcated, you're not supposed to be here,
Right. Yeah.
especially people of color, especially poor people, right? So I was just so I think I grew up around that, and my parents would say things, like, "Oh, that shouldn't be that way," or "That don't repeat what your neighbor said." I mean,
Yeah.
they were kind of doing like little corrections along the way. So I'll credit them for like helping me like sort of live in a space and not accept the lens that was given,
Yeah.
a little bit. And then I went on. I went on between graduate and undergraduate school. I worked with people who identified as women surviving domestic violence, and so that was another way in which, like, architecture and space is really articulated of like what is a safe space, in a space that is told to be safe, your house.
Yeah.
So like in this way, I think that I was doing a regular job that had nothing to do with art per se, but I think I was thinking spatially about like, oh, how people survive and manage their lives when um, in an unsafe situation, by negotiating space.
Yeah.
And so when I moved to LA, over time I sort of took this up and was really struck by something that's very common all over Los Angeles. I'd been living in Portland, which is like hippy dippy. Nobody has fences in their front yard. To LA, where there were a lot of fences, but also too, I was really struck by how many yard signs had that were from um, what are they called? Sorry, it's the end of the day here, and it's cold. yard signs that were for security companies that would say armed response.
Yeah.
Like, whatever the security company names are, whatever, and it would say armed response. And I was like, dang, that's no joke, like, that's crazy. I'd never seen anything like that, right? And so it was just kind of like, for me, I felt like that was like really hostile.
Yeah.
And so, so that kind of led me to thinking about, like the individual ways in which we segregate, but also, we are in a context, and that is, there's all kinds of ways in which structures support our individual affects or feelings. And so I was interested in both, like, the individual ways that people self-styled architecture for exclusion or inclusion and or survival, and the sort of structural ways that the city, the state, or organized at the sort of substructure that created inclusion or exclusion. Well, I mean, it's interesting. Some people have said I should return to that work, but I haven't because I'm busy doing other things. At one point, like, I did want to, like, do that project in a lot of places. But one thing happened is I moved to Central Illinois, and in Central Illinois, like, that kind of architecture is really less obvious.
Right. Yeah.
In other words, like, sorry,
it's okay.
I'm gonna have to.
It's
I
okay.
might have to torture my dog. He's like, please play with me, somebody. So then I was like, moved to Central Illinois, in which, like, another kind of, I was kind of became interested there in, like, this other, go. I had to lock them out.
No worries, no worries.
Because one of them knows how to actually open the door. Anyway, it's really complicated. And you might be able to hear this, like, muffled sound in the background. It's the dog trying to open the door. But anyway, so I moved to Central Illinois, and then I was kind of interested in, like, how do you see that kind of self-segregation in this other place, and what are the signs of that kind of spatial segregation, and frankly, like, actually, what I did find is that I was living in a college town because my partner got a job at this big university, and in that kind of, like, little liberal town, people, like, segregation, maybe much like the town that I grew up in, it was much more spatial. So, like, poor folks of color lived in one part of town, poor folks of another color lived in another part of town, like, it was organized that way. So, like, you didn't see fences and stuff like that as much, but nonetheless, I think just my attention shifted because of the context that I lived in. So right. I wasn't really interested in, like, going out and finding, like, traversing cities and looking at, like, this kind of architecture, because really the stuff that I pointed out in that first project is really just kind of emblematic of many other kinds of structures. Right. Like, one doesn't need to point them all out, but when I moved to Central Illinois, I also started teaching in this prison, and that's when I was just thinking about, like, if I'm thinking about, like, the scales of segregation, so there's a scale of the micro bus bench, but then there's a scale of, like, city planning, and then there's, like, this ultimate scale, and that is one of the prison. Right. And so I just started thinking a lot more. I mean, first of all, I was, like, thrown into this, or I put myself in this position where I, like, really needed to train up and, like, educate myself on, like, what, anyway, it was a little bit of a whirlwind, and I was just, like, I moved from Los Angeles to a place of, like, 30,000 people, well, really 150,000 people, most of them students, in the middle of the country, which I never lived in, and I was like, what is up with all these cornfields? Like, so the whole thing was, like, a mind fuck, and it took me a couple of years to figure it out, but the short of it is that I didn't think about returning to those things, because I guess I do think that, like, one doesn't, or for me, I didn't feel like I needed to point out every structure and
Right.
call it out. So, I mean, basically, I started just teaching through a community college program, and in Illinois, which is different from California, at the time, at least like 10 years ago, Illinois had a couple of community college programs that offered academic classes. So I was teaching an art history class. But one of the things that like I needed to like train myself up on is like number one, like intellectually, like I read all this stuff about incarceration. I mean, I'd done some work around this, and of course, had read a lot of stuff in college about all kinds of issues of segregation and otherness and all this kind of stuff. But
Yeah.
then walking into a prison and like in the free world, like there are very few classrooms that are predominantly black men.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, what's up with that?
Yeah.
But in prison, it's all black men, and so like this is like a problem, right? And so you have to ask like, why is this happening in this space and not in another space? So I kind of like you know um, spent like 2 years really like training myself, and I started a reading group on the outside with people, just to like we watched films, when we read books, and then worked with people inside, and we did a reading group there too. This is just stuff that people wanted, but I was there just really because I was teaching a community college. I was teaching a class through a community college program, and I basically answered a call, and I was like, oh, I've worked when I did work with people surviving domestic violence. I worked in a jail, in a women's unit, and there, like, we were just giving like safety, like talking to people about safety plans.
Yeah.
And so we weren't, we had no program. It was just like individually, like, when you get out, how here's some resources in the community. How do you keep safe? Whatever, that kind of stuff. So I was like, oh, I think I can do this. But really, I was like, holy shit, like the first class I had, a student in the class had been in prison as long as I'd been alive.
Wow.
And I was just like, wow, what's going on? So I spent time like training myself up, but I just basically taught an art history course, which I also was like a little ill-equipped to do because like my degree is not in art history. It was in like art from Irvine, which like you don't even have to pick a discipline. And so my mom, it turns out, was teaching that same class at a community college in North Carolina, and so we were like trading notes. And so I taught that class, pretty. The first time around, I taught it thinking like, I'm not going to use this silly old Western art history book.
Yeah.
I'm going to bring in all these other things. And
Cool.
I found that people in the class were just like, hang on, what are you doing? Like, what is all this additional stuff? Like, what is in the book? Like, why are you introducing this new stuff?
Yeah.
And I realized over time that people were saying to me basically like, hey, like all this stuff that's in this book, it's actually talked about in popular culture, and I don't know it. And so to hear like this guy was like, I was watching TV and somebody was talking about like the Renaissance or whatever, and he said, and I totally got what they were saying. And so like, then I tried to like teach those things, but also with a critical lens, and not necessarily like introduce like, some obscure art group alongside, I think so through that kind of teaching, it really, it was really interesting. I went on to teach adults in other contexts, and people primarily that had been like blocked or locked or otherwise just not in the sort of formal education system, had brought all kinds of knowledge to the classroom, but it just was situated differently than mine. Maybe they had a kind of informal knowledge, and I had a formal, through the university kind of knowledge, and so it was interesting classes, but it was basically a regular art history course. And I did that for 6 years, and I worked with artists that, like, the artists in that prison would, like, ask me to do, they had an art room there. They weren't allowed to do anything in their cell, and they weren't allowed to have art supplies in their cell, but they did have an art room that some guy, a staff member of the prison, like, would open up random hours, like literally he had to be there at the prison to open up the art room. And about 15 or 20 guys were in the art room, and they would ask me to come do studio visits or critiques with them.
Wow.
And so I would do that, and then I tried to get them some shows, places, because small community places around town would show work, and so I did that. And then after 6 years of working there, doing this reading group, and then simultaneously kind of definitely working with organizations in the community around issues of incarceration, criminalization, education, everything with the ION. I'm kidding. I kind of had, it just took time to I wasn't a plan, but I just was like immersed in all these kind of communities. And another thing that was important, I would say, is that I started to know and learn about artists that were doing stuff with incarcerated people, and thinking of it as ways to change policy, because that was another thing, is like I never was interested in like making art about my experience working with people who are incarcerated, but one thing that I was interested in is like, okay, people, this is fucked up, there's no, like, this is wrong, and there's nothing about this that is right. And so like maybe art can be used as a tool to do that call out culture and look at, call out kind of systemic things. And so and ideally that needed to be heard from the voices of people who are experiencing that, but like maybe I could be this kind of in between or something like that.
Right.
And so that's not to say I did try to do some different projects, etc. But the short of it is that I left Champaign-Urbana, where I was living, and moved up here. Like I was commuting to Chicago the whole time, teaching at the Art Institute. And so then after that, I just said, like, I told my partner, I was like, you got to commute, so we swapped places. And so we moved up here, and someone asked me if I would teach at Stateville, which is close to here. I mean, Stateville is kind of like the San Quentin of California. It's an old prison. It was built, like the keys are like this, to open doors. And I mean, it's old. And it actually has one of the last roundhouses in the nation. That's a building that's built on the architecture of Jeremy Bentham. It's a Capticon. So Illinois just closed down a roundhouse like 2 years ago at Stateville, but before people had been living in that building. And so anyway, somebody asked me if I would teach at Stateville, and I said yes, that I would. But I knew from this long experience that it would be important to do it with other people. It'd be important to bring in other artists, and it'd be important to like kind of center the work in a particular kind of way that would foreground, concerns of people inside, that would not make a spectacle out of something, that would just be careful about the kind of politics the kind of ways that we made art together, and that we centered it as a kind of collaborative work, because a lot of people in prison have an amazing art practice. I mean, they have a studio practice that's way more rigorous than mine. They have time to make art, or they make time to make art, because it's like what keeps for some people, they'll say it's what keeps them together. They need this this thing, and I get it. I mean, I think a lot of artists need to make, right? And so, we it was a way of like trying to bring together practices, the sort of studio practice of the prison, and the kind of other weird practice that the rest of us bring, that is both studio and sort of collaborative practices, with a framework of trying to teach an outside audience, right? That was another thing, is like, I think that there's been, at least in the last 5 or 6 years at least, there's been a lot of art exhibitions that are like art by people in prison. And the subject matter is people in prison, and like that's totally not interested in me. Not because I'm a mean person necessarily. Well, I could be mean, but because I think it makes it makes these artists that are good artists and intellectual people and whatever, it makes them the subject of something that's only framed by prison.
Right, and it's like a reduction.
It's a reduction, right? And so that was the starting point of the project, is to like, I taught these formal classes where people were getting credits, which was awesome. And then we just started this thing, just kind of like out of our scraps. We didn't have a institution backing or anything like that. And just said, okay, let's try this and see if we can't think about a way to make meaningful pedagogical projects with incarcerated folks to like both highlight the work that they do, but also kind of bring education from the inside out. I mean, I can say that, like, I remember years ago, probably 8 or 10 years ago, talking to some friends of ours, and they're a couple, and the man was a union organizer in apartheid South Africa, and he's black South African, and the woman was a student during the Iranian Revolution, and she had organized women during the Iranian Revolution, and both of those people were like, art is central to movements. Mm-hmm. Art is like everything to political movements, and I was just like, what? That, like, not the art that I'm looking at. Like, if I go to, like, the Hammer, or not the Hammer, if I go to, the LACMA, that doesn't feel like the kind of art that's central to movements. And so that was one thing that was interesting to think about, is like, oh, like, is the art that I look at about the same things that I care about, Yeah. And so that was interesting. And then also, too, this lawyer, Joey Mogul, who's a friend, who's representing torture survivors, another thing that she said once was, Joey said, the law cannot do anything else here. So here are, like, hundreds of people that have been tortured by this police officer, and then his officers went on to torture more people. So there's like something like 600 people total that have, torture claims, and the state of Illinois had to set up a special commission for it and all this kind of shit. And she said the law, that they had exhausted the law.
Wow.
And so, and because, basically all you can do is like convict this person. So now what, And so, and of course, you can get people out of prison. So that's exciting. That's important. But it just, so like when Joey said that, they were like pointing to the fact that and talking about, like, art has this potential, culture has this potential to do something else. And so really those two friends, those two incidences really made me think, like, oh, maybe this tool I have, which I'd mostly been like making posters for protests and stuff like that, that I thought maybe this tool I have could help mobilize something, and then, like the critic Jeff Chang always has talked about, that culture precedes political change, that you actually, and I think especially around the issues of incarceration, I feel like that there are so many laws that are scaffolded to lock people up, and there's a long history of creating criminals,
Yeah.
And every time the veil is pulled back to see that is a construction, a new veil is made to continue to create criminals, or to create criminality, right?
Yeah.
And so I feel like that there's a role, there's a really important role. And certainly I'll go back and talk a little bit about the ARCA suits for a second.
Yeah.
Another thing that was really important in that project for me is that when I was looking at, like, urban design, or, landscape design of cities, I came across this program called Crime Prevention Through Environmental Design. And it's a tool that I don't know if it's still used now, but it was used. I mean, it's popularly used in urban planning programs, right? And it's like, it has this premise that you can design landscapes to prevent crime. And what they were calling crime is like having sex in public, using the restroom in public, sleeping in public, right? Yeah. Like, and so that was another thing where it was like, hang on, my field. Oh, and then LAPD had a program called Design Out Crime. And I was like, hang on, my field, design, that program is using my field to control people, you know? And I just thought, like, and that's bullshit. And so that project was also responding to responding to that idea that so the places that I was looking at with arcosuits, and I did this other project where I was like pushing on things with my body, and was meant to like sort of test I was just interested if those things were designed to like resist some bodies, then I wanted to like push back on them.
Yeah.
Like in the literal, and then I thought it's not enough to push back on them. You might as well get comfortable on them, and but that is, I just went on off road for a second, but I was just interested in the ways that that art has and continues in many ways to be a tool for control, and in that benign way, right? So like the art program that young people have to participate in the juvenile detention center, like that's scary shit,
Yeah.
because there are ways in which, it's a kind of like tacit way of control. In fact, there's so many ways in which art and acculturation has been part of controlling people, right? Civilizing people, right? And so, so what was I saying? Yeah. So the idea, so I was skeptical of the way in which art could participate in something like social change and social movements. And when these other people that I found to be like, wholeheartedly, critical political people with really high stakes and movements, that they were part of movements. When they said that, it made me like have a different feeling about it. And then to your second question about like, what was your second question about, people feeling like they should put social justice or something like that in their art?
Yes.
I mean, I think that I will say for myself, it wasn't like I went looking for this. It was like I was participating in something that I didn't consider part of my artwork or anything like that. I was actually doing other projects related to landscape and global agriculture as practice. But I feel like that I guess in some ways I wanted to, it's not even that I consciously wanted to merge stuff. I just felt like that art, it can be really powerful. The process of making art together can be really powerful.
Yeah.
And that in fact, like we need all fronts. Like we need political work, we need legislative work, and we need cultural work,
Right.
to like celebrate people's lives, to point out problems, and to also imagine something that is completely different. Like to imagine and live in a world that's completely different,